He said, "We are going young." That's the message to fans. We're going young. And they never once said that meant uncompetitive.
Welcome into Northside Territory, Foul Territory Network's Cubs podcast. I'm Sahadev Sharma. Today's episode, Patrick, Mooney, and I are joined by Derrick Goold. Derrick is the longtime Cardinals beat writer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, award-winning beat writer. Why did we decide to talk Cardinals? We just find that they're at a fascinating point in building that team. They're not calling it a rebuild. It's a reset, according to Derrick and the people with the Cardinals. That should sound familiar to Cubs fans. It's not a rebuild. And just the decision to make drastic changes to the front office. Player development is a big area that the Cardinals are focusing on, where they fell behind. This should sound familiar to Cubs fans. And I think, and I asked Derrick about it, I think it's hugely relevant to the Cubs, because if this is a significant change in direction as far as one-loss record on the field for the major league team, 1, 2, 3, however long it takes, however long the Cardinals are down, the Cubs have to take advantage, right? The Cubs have to take advantage of the Cardinals being down. The Pirates and Reds, are they young and talented? Sure. Brewers, that's the team they're chasing. But the Cardinals are perennially have been the team that kind of set the example in the NL Central. The Cubs, if they're down, the Cubs have to take advantage and be more aggressive and make sure that they're at the top, do all they can to get to the top. That's where how I look at this with the Cardinals, with regards to the Cardinals. Let's get to our conversation. It's a long one. Derrick knows this organization inside and out. So let's get right to it. Derrick Goold with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Derrick, thank you for joining us. We always read your coverage and enjoy hearing your thoughts, but I think both of us kind of looked at what's going on in St. Louis and had echoes of the Cubs trying to kind of reinvent themselves over the years here. And I was just curious, maybe to start, like, when you look back, obviously you've covered the Cardinals for a long time and have deep institutional knowledge. Like, what were sort of the moments or turning points that led up to this eventual transfer of power at Busch Stadium?
Wow. Yeah, I guess, how far back do you want to go? I mean, you have, gosh, I mean, you could go back to the tragedy, right, which is Oscar Taveras' death there in 2014. And then the Cardinals trading for Jason Hayward. I think maybe the inflection point that would involve the Cubs has mostly to do with Hayward choosing the Cubs over the Cardinals. This was the Cardinals model for so long had been trade for a guy, bring him in, sell him on staying, extend him, right? And it was, and there were examples where that didn't work, but most of them were like they spent, the player and the team spent some time together and decided, yeah, we're not for each other. Like, we'd like to move on. This was a case where Hayward had a remarkable season. He was part of a really good team, one of the best run prevention teams that I've ever seen. I mean, excuse the comparison, but I mean, that Cardinals team in 2015 was like the 85 Bears of baseball. They just were suffocating when it came to run prevention. A lot of that had to do with defense, and one of their best defensive players was Jason Hayward, who also had a really long second half offensively. And it was like, this is going to work. And like, he's connected with the hitting coaches, Bill Miller, John Mabry at the time. And it was like, okay, yeah. And then the Cardinals were going to make this offer unlike they'd ever made before, with the except to a position player. They had David Price that they thought was another deal, which maybe is another inflection point for them, when David Price said, yeah, I'm going to come to the Cardinals. And then the next day signed with Boston at a rate that just the Cardinals couldn't match. Dombrowski just came over the top to get him. But I really think it is Hayward. I think it's Hayward, and the initial rush and performance of the team in response to his younger core comment, if you guys remember that, and him choosing a deal that I think ultimately was more lucrative for him, but was not guaranteed to be more lucrative for him. The Cardinals had the bigger guaranteed offer. And for them to go, okay, we're going to do this for a position player. We're going to do this for a guy who's been here, who's shown us, and then he chooses to go elsewhere. That was like a crack in the model. That was it.
Wow.
That was the fissure. And then you see them, in the subsequent years. Think about it. They just were desperate to get a cleanup hitter. They wanted Christian Yelich. That was their preferred get, but the Marlins weren't offering it. The Marlins were controlling who they weren't offering him, and they were controlling who they were offering, and they wanted to get Stanton off the books first. So the Cardinals had a deal in place for Stanton. He said no. That makes another one who said no. He wanted to go to the Yankees, of course. But the Cardinals had a deal in place the Marlins agreed to. And then that deal became the structure for the Ozuna deal that they eventually did make, because they were unsure if they would ever get the chance to trade for Yelich. And they did not want to leave that musical chair off season without a seat, because the alternative, the Giants and the Cardinals were in the same conversations, right? And the Cardinals traded for Marcell Ozuna, and what did the Giants do? They signed Andrew McCutchen. So these were the choices that the Cardinals were kind of looking through, and their preference was to go sign Ozuna, who was coming off a ferocious year. I mean, just really a tremendous year. And then he just didn't work out here. He didn't perform like he did with the Marlins or like he has with Atlanta. And it cost them Sandy Alcantara and Zach Gallen, and the list goes on and on, right? Okay. Yeah. So you see how the fissure became a gap, and then the gap became a race to cover it. And then the lessons of Hayward leaving and not wanting to keep Ozuna became, well, we got to prove that we're still a destination team. And Paul Goldschmidt, they trade for him, and he signs the extension. Okay, model's back on track. Oh, Nolan Arenado wants out of Colorado. Oh, he's willing to come. He's eagerly wanting to come to St. Louis. He's wanting to make this work. He's willing to manipulate and change and adjust and negotiate his contract to be a Cardinal. Okay, this is it. We're back on the map. The Cardinals are back on the map. They're a destination team again. But in the process of that, they obviously pushed their major league roster and their major league payroll in a way that a lot of times we wondered, well, why are you stopping one step short of being a juggernaut? Why are you stopping one step short of being a juggernaut? And they would point to the spending. They would talk about the commitment to the years. The times that they were just pitching light, they thought that they could rely on a system to produce pitchers, and it just wasn't anymore. And so that's kind of how this erosion took place, right? The model cracked with Hayward saying, "I'd rather be a Cub." And I'm not saying that that was the thing that wasn't the final piece or the first piece of the Django Tower that toppled, but at least it's at least symbolic of it. And then of what they were chasing ever since. Along the way they had managerial fires, they had a reduction in staff that they never went back from. They had a pandemic, and they had a farm system that did not produce the pitching when it was most needed.
Derrick, I find so much of this fascinating, and I want to get to the player development stuff in a moment, but I'm curious about how much. I believe it was 2022 when they were struggling mightily, and then went on just a ridiculous run and ended up making the playoffs. Was that kind of an inflection point too, where maybe more drastic changes would have come had they not made that run?
The 18-game winning streak.
Yeah, they made that run and they made the playoffs. It seemed like, we'd be looking at 3 straight playoff-less seasons, or maybe longer. I can't keep track of it, but an extended playoff list run for St. Louis, which just doesn't happen. Not this century, at least. It doesn't seem like that's a thing that happens for the Cardinals. So I'm curious, like, how much would we have been talking about this a year or two ago had that run not happened? Did that kind of give Mo and this group a little bit more of a runway to kind of, ease the exit, so it wasn't kind of like this? Were they on the hot seat at that point, I guess?
I don't think so, no, because they had a quality team. They had a manager that they were about to extend. They did have some members of the staff that were canaries in the coal mine shouting out problems in the farm system, but they still had the license to improve it. You had Paul Goldschmidt with multiple years left. You had Nolan Arenado with multiple years left. You were not yet at a point where you thought you'd run out of pitching prospects or pitching potential. Right. I mean, you had Alex Reyes as an all-star closer at that point in time. Right. He obviously delivered the pitch that bounced them from the playoffs that year. I think, against the Dodgers in that one game wild card playoff, but he was, he was part of a youth group still. Seems like he was a prospect forever, but he was still part of a group of, you think back, you got Dakota Hudson, who had not yet struggled yet. So you had a lot of things going on. Plus you had and maybe to your point, like you had the adrenaline rush of, because of that winning streak, it was like, okay, this is finally the team that they thought they'd be. You had Nolan Arenado winning a division for the first time, and he's like, okay, this is why I came here. And, you had all that stuff. And then Ryan Helsley was a part of that group. He was a young player with, coming up. So then you see what he's become now. So I think they had the ingredients there, as I'm trying to think back on that roster. Regardless of whether they had that winning streak or not, the winning streak was just kind of proof of concept, if you will. But they felt they had the good roster there not to pivot away from it so quickly. I don't think they were like, oh well, it wasn't like in 06, right? Like 06, that team wins 83 games, gets healthy, then just blitzes the postseason and wins a World Series, right? And then in the 06-07 offseason, it's like, okay, well, let's bring that team back. It's like, no, those were the fumes that got to the World Series. That team was on fumes, and then they brought the team back, and then they had a losing season in 07, and that led to a lot of significant changes. It was not like that, where it was like, oh, okay, well, this is the peak, and this is these are the fumes of this roster. No, it was like this is the roster at full strength, and is it going to win 18 consecutive games all the time? No, that's not going to happen. But can it play like that? Then absolutely. And can it be outfitted with young talent that was on its way, especially a couple of those pitchers? Then yes. So I don't think that would have led them to pivot to younger. If anything, that would have emboldened them to stick with what they had. In part because their nucleus, that Goldschmidt Arenado tandem, was still in the midst of their contracts.
Hey, FT fam, it's Alana Rizzo. I can't stop talking about Viori. Viori is perfect if you are sick and tired of traditional old workout gear. I wear Viori in all settings, not just in the gym, because honestly, it's comfier than whatever you're currently wearing. No joke. I'm wearing Viori daily leggings right now. They're high-waisted with the drawstring and cupped ankles. They look good and they feel great. You're going to love them. Viori is an investment in your happiness. For our listeners, they are offering 20% off your first purchase. Get yourself some of the most comfortable and versatile clothing on the planet at viori.com/foul. That's VUORI.com/foul. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but enjoy free shipping on any U.S. orders over $75 and free returns. Go to viori.com/foul and discover the versatility of Viori clothing.
Derrick, could you reintroduce John Mozeliak to us and our audience? Because I think it's interesting. He's like a state school guy, not an Ivy League guy. Like, he came up on the scouting side from the very lowest rungs of baseball operations. And then you kind of see him with his like bow tie and like tailored sport coats, and see where kind of the Cardinals have gone, and very model heavy and things like that. He also may have been on like a Hall of Fame trajectory when you look at his career, and judging by some of the coverage and reactions on social media, it seems like Cardinals fans, are ready for a big change in the front office. Like how does this transition to your work? Where does he go from here? And what is his kind of like, I don't know,
How far,
the end
how
of this?
far, how far back do you want me to go? I mean, to his boyhood in Boulder, Colorado.
No, I know you go way back. It's more just these front offices, the figureheads, kind
Well,
of
there
take
were times when we were at Boulder
know?
Reservoir, probably at the same time. Both, he's a teenager, I was a kid. Well, so I mean, when you say he started at the lowest rung, I mean, he quite honestly started as a left-handed BP pitcher for the Colorado Rockies, and watching him, paying attention, and picking up mentors there, Don Zimmer, and then of course the front office guys there, Bob Gebhardt being foremost and probably most well known among them, and then from there, from working his way up from BP pitcher, left-handed BP pitcher, which they needed, right? And he had a friend of a friend of a friend, and they're like, "Oh wait, I know a guy who throws left-handed. I know a guy who can throw strikes. Let's bring him on over." He goes into and he went to CU, right? Started off at Arizona, but finished it at CU there in Boulder, and he worked his way up and then gets the offer to come to the Cardinals when Walt Jocketty takes over with new ownership here in St. Louis. The brewery had owned the team, sold the team. The group that was not known as the DeWitt Group at the time, really. There were other leading members of that ownership group. It is still the same ownership group, and DeWitt is the chairman, but there through the purchasing process, there were many other names. Many of them went to school here in St. Louis at a rather renowned high school here, and they knew each other from there, but they all had roots in St. Louis. But as that ownership group took over and Walt Jocketty came in and brought Tony La Russa in, among the people he brought in was John Mozeliak. So you're looking at 3 decades with the Cardinals, and it's obviously well known that the Cardinals drafted Albert Pujols in the later rounds, right? 13th round. It's well known that the Cardinals drafted Yadier Molina. Less well known is the fact that Mozeliak was heavily involved in that. Like, for some odd reason, that's less well known. It's not for lack of coverage. It's just for lack of, I don't know. The things that catch a hook and stay forever are really interesting, and I'm not quite sure why. But he was involved in that, whether cross-checking or running the draft. He was also overseeing things when they had what was called the lost draft, just a draft that they did not invest in, that they did not feel like they had a lot of knowledge for, purposefully, as they made the shift to analytics, right? And they were pretty early on in the Moneyball run. That, of course, is related to ownership hiring Luno. And then Mozeliak, who was assistant general manager by this point in time, became very involved in trying to unite those. They were kind of bicameral, right? Like, they had the pro or the scouting side and the stats side. And if there was a person who went in between, it was Mozeliak, who was trying to unite them for the common goal. He was heavily involved, and Jocketty will tell you, he was heavily involved in doing some of the contracts, identifying some guys. Mark Grizzolonic stands out, as the Cardinals went through this second base churn. One of the reasons why they did that is because they thought that, second base was probably the biggest pool of players you could choose from each year. You could have shortstops on the downside of their careers, third baseman on the downside of their careers, young second baseman who had an injury or a struggle and needed to bounce back. They just felt it was the biggest pool, and that you could get a lot of bang for your buck by churning through that position for a while. And it worked out for them. I mean, Tony Womack on a championship team. Mark Grizzolonic was remarkable here, and was really essential to a team that then won 100 games. David Eckstein at shortstop. You think about that team. But anyway, so you see how most fingerprints and influence are all part of that. And then when there was significant fractures in the front office, and ownership, Bill DeWitt Jr., decided that the change had to take place after that losing season in 2007. Mozeliak was the interim for about 30 days. And then on Halloween of that year, he was named the general manager. And a lot of that reason was because he had been able to mend fences and create, get people to work together, and that he saw the DeWitt's vision of, making profit and being more nimble and being more aggressive with analytics, and continuing to find a model that had both a strong farm system, but also a payroll that punched above the size of its market. And this was the model, right? Get people in, win them over with the culture, with the winning habits, spend above the market because of the support of the fans, and tie payroll to 3.2 million, 3.4 million, whatever they had coming in, and then have a farm system to make it all work and make it all possible, and not drain that farm system with trades that with you later. And in 2011, the Cardinals won the World Series and had the #1 farm system. And they're very proud of that, like that daily double, right? Like you have the championship at the major league level, and you have the industry saying you also have the best farm system. And then a few years later, Mozeliak, I don't know how much in the weeds you want me to get here, but he gets promoted to president of baseball operations. He says at the time that one of the reasons for the promotion was it would free him up because he felt the Cardinals were losing some of their edge, and he wanted to regain that, and that was going to be a priority for him, was looking at areas where they could regain some of their competitive advantage and, yes, some of their business advantage. And it does not, it bores people, I'm sure, but part of that was, the Memphis Redbirds, their AAA affiliate, was run as a not-for-profit, and that's how it was established. And that was causing, it was a good thing, and they've maintained some of that charitable edge, but it was causing issues with improvements and continued relationships. And the Cardinals just wanted that to be their forever affiliate. And their idea was to buy it. And Mozeliak kind of led that. How do you move it out of this not-for-profit and move all those implications out? What does that mean for a ballpark and the city, right? Because these are separate things, the team and the ballpark. And so he spent a lot of time traveling down there for city board meetings, lobbying, all that stuff. And so this was part of his well, this is what we're going to do. He wanted to build a pitching lab. He wanted to radically modernize and enhance the team's spring training facility. For about a decade now, they've known that it's a decade behind, so that puts it even another decade behind. But all these things just they haven't gone at the speed that he wanted, the Cardinals wanted, but specifically, let me underscore that he wanted, and that he specifically talked about doing when he was president of baseball operations. Pulls off the trade for Paul Goldschmidt. So I'm fast forwarding a few more years. They get back into the playoffs. This obviously is just after the era of the Cubs winning their first World Series, which came a year after they bounced the Cardinals, a pretty good Cardinals team from October, and continued the descent that we talked about. So now the Cardinals are back in the playoffs. Things are going well. They like the team they have. They're building it around Paul Goldschmidt. They feel like the farm system is better. Not to glance over the hacking scandal that took place that then wiped out a first round for them and also put a dent in their reputation. That also happened in all this time just before the promotion to president of baseball operations. So you have all this going on, right? But now they have a footing. They feel like they're going in a direction. Mo talks about having a succession plan. He starts putting that in place. You start hearing from more of his lieutenants. There's a few promotions. I'm not sure the timing of it, but there are a few promotions where now they have multiple assistant general managers instead of just one. You see, and this is on purpose, they show you the flow chart of decisions and how voices are growing, and it's not just Mozeliak leading it. And then a pandemic happens. And then the Cardinals have an outbreak that puts them 19 days out. And ever since then, Mozeliak has been back. in the days leading up to the shutdown and that spring training leading up, there was more from other members of the front office. General Manager Michael Gersh was more prominent. He was doing some of the public media things. But in the time that followed the pandemic and then the years that have followed since, it's been Mozeliak back very clearly as the face of the front office, and very much doing a lot of the day-to-day that we used to associate with the general manager, and now we associate with the president of baseball operations, but not seeking out. But in addition to that, also trying to find these edges that just kept coming, just being out of reach for them. Look, they were supposed to break ground a year plus ago on their new facility in Jupiter, got all the construction, got it all ready and everything like that. And then a third party, I guess it would be a fourth party because the Marlins are the third party, I guess. But a fourth party did not have the right permits. So it delayed it 12 months. I mean, this is what they've run into. And you go, well, why wasn't that taken care of? Well, I mean, to be honest, they hire people to do that. And it's hard to go like, well, did the Cardinals make a bad choice? Did the Marlins make a bad choice on that? No, the person they hired, or the entity that they hired, it wasn't one person, the entity that they hired just didn't navigate bureaucracy right. I think we can all empathize with not being able to navigate bureaucracy. Right?
Wow.
but it doesn't cost us a year.
Right.
That sounds like a Cubby occurrence. Dude.
Yeah, right. That's not that's not Cardinals-esque.
No, so that's a long-winded answer of how they got here. Along the way, one other thing, there's just this urban legend of Jeff Luna, who was a huge part of what the Cardinals did and how they modernized, but lost from that, the big glowing neon marquee lights and how prominent Jeff Luna was and how much he talked about all the things he was doing, was the role Mozeliak played in that. There are a lot of examples of the late round picks that the Cardinals took that they had great success in. And a lot of credit has not gone to Sig Madoll for that, for some of the stuff that he did that helped them find small college guys like Matt Adams stands out. A couple of the pitchers that contributed, not many stars, but also Trevor Rosenthal was really good, right? Trevor Rosenthal was a great closer for the Cardinals. And he was drafted with one of these gut sticker kind of things, right? That they put like this guy's going to work out. But he also was drafted under the schematic that Mozeliak said, look, when in doubt, pick the athlete. He was like, I want to find athletic pitchers. And they talked about this. And Mozeliak, this brings it all the way back, right? You're talking about the scouting aspect, what he brought to it. That is where that came in. So you had all these analytics. They had really beefed up. They were doing great. And then, Mozeliak adds that little nudge at the end, when in doubt, take the athlete. And so they took Trevor Rosenthal, who was a strong arm shortstop. Yeah. And they're like, this guy can be a pitcher for us. And there are a lot of examples of that. Carlos Martinez is an example of that. He signed as a shortstop with the Red Sox, but the Cardinals worked to sign him as a pitcher. And so you look at some of the strong pitching development that they had there, of which Brett Strom also deserves a lot of credit for. And Mozeliak's influence on that is there, even if it didn't get trumpeted when the other folks did when they move elsewhere. That tends to be the case, right? When somebody else moves elsewhere, all the things that they succeeded where they were gets celebrated. So I guess maybe that's something that Mozeliak didn't have, right? He didn't go elsewhere.
Right.
So beat writers like me didn't really write a whole lot about what he was doing, or it didn't get as much attention nationally because he didn't move. He had his chances to move, but he didn't.
Derrick, I talked about the player development. Obviously, it sounds like Chaim Bloom was brought in partly for that originally, and now he's obviously part of the succession plan and will be in charge. And I guess
he is the succession plan. No, he is.
He is the succession plan.
He's not part of it. He is.
And looking at it from afar, it feels like to me he got a raw deal in Boston. He didn't really get a chance to see out a plan that he had in place that seems decently thought out. When you're forced to trade a superstar like Mookie Betts, it wasn't like he was like, this is the best idea in the world to trade this guy. And looking at their system, it clearly he had some sort of positive impact in Boston. I'm curious how much of from what I know, which is not nearly as much as you, the amateur scouting is solid there. They do a good job of drafting, identifying talent. Player development is behind. And this is an area where what Patrick started with, the Cubs were behind 5 years ago. I think it was Theo that made the comment, the winner's curse. They got bit by the winner's curse, and they were winning, so they thought everything was good. So why make these changes? And they were against the direction player development was headed in this business. And the reality is player development is so much more important than we thought, 10, 15, whatever, 20 years ago. And there's a much bigger impact that can be made. How hesitant has St. Louis been to making those changes, or is it just part of, what happened there? And is that the area that you'd point to as well? Like this has to be addressed, and this is where Chaim can help.
Yeah. Since I started on this beat, and had a chance to kind of talk with, one of the benefits when I started on the beat was just like the people I got to work with, were, the late Joe Strauss and the late Rick Hummel, and how much knowledge they brought to baseball, but also how much they covered. Like just they were the ocean, right? And that left the little continents for me to cover. And one of the continents was player development. And so, I remember pretty early on, getting a lot of chance to talk with even George Kissel, obviously, who's a legend here in St. Louis, but also, Bruce Mano, who was heavily involved in farm director here, and just a lot about that. And I bring that up just because it became the way I kind of looked at it, and having grown up around AAA baseball and sort of the minor league notion, and reading Baseball America so much. I always thought like it's very interesting how much we celebrate where a guy is drafted and when a player debuts. And like, then there's like the locked box between the two, like
right,
where all the good stuff happens.
Yeah.
Right. And I often thought about that. Like, why do we just redact this area of the player's career?
Right.
And so when I set out, I was like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I want to try to always think of players through this prism: draft, development, debut. And even when I was doing the prospect rankings for Baseball America, I would think about that. I would think about like, okay, yes, fine, rank them high because of where they were drafted, but do not rank them high solely on where they were drafted. Also consider the prominence of their position: shortstop, for example, high demand; catcher, high demand, but also proximity to the majors and what development did for them. Who is this player now? Not who were they when they were coming out of high school,
right,
not who they were coming out of college. And so we've had a real chance here. And the Cardinals have had farm directors, Gary LaRocque most recently, who's retiring, who were eager to kind of talk about the development thing, and which just sagged behind because of infrastructure. And it has been a real focal point for us in covering for a long time, because going back, you could go back 10 years and we write about how they were expediting arrivals, right? And they were getting them to the majors younger, in part because they were like, look, star players are there in their mid-20s, and there's not this quota of at bats and quota of innings that they need to check mark in the minors. Let them go. I remember writing about like the different stages that the Cardinals had set up as far as what they wanted to see from pitchers: command of fastball, command of two pitches, this kind of thing at each level. And once you did that, you moved up. And then also how they viewed AA as on the brink of AAA. Like they would promote from AA to the majors. They saw that gap, and they weren't alone in this, but they saw that gap as not as significant between AA and AAA as it was between those two levels in the majors. So I like talking about player development. And then over the last few years, this again goes back to the pandemic, really. They just have had this erosion of infrastructure. They haven't been able to have the investment. They did make an investment in tech, and then in some cases the tech just sat there not used because the staff didn't didn't either know or didn't feel it was valuable, or some thought it was alchemy, statistical alchemy, and not actual different, not something that would actually make a difference. They outfitted every player with blast devices, got really good responses for hitting. They built a hitting barn. They made advances. Mason Wynn is definitely a product of all the investment, and Alec Burleson is too, in the development of hitters. They got that, and Jeff Albert was a big part of that. And they just didn't get that same thing on the pitching side. They didn't get the investment. They didn't get the pitching lab up and running. And then when they had reductions of staff, they didn't fill it out. They haven't had a field coordinator for a while. They had one after Mark DeJean, but he left, and they didn't refill that. They had a catching coordinator briefly several years ago. They haven't had the roaming instructors that they once did at their peak. They just haven't filled jobs. Their minor league staffs are far smaller than their rivals. They might have one or two kind of level of coaches that most teams have for pitchers at every level. One or two at every level. The Cardinals might have one or two total for their minor league system, depending on what the depending on how you look at those responsibilities or titles. They just have had this over time, and then add in the fact that, and they'll acknowledge this. They came out of the lost year of 2020 for minor leagues, and they're like, well, let's treat it as if that happened. And they pushed everybody up a level, and we're very aggressive with that. And the result was the worst system, one of the worst system winning percentage since the 60s. Wow. Not for the Cardinals, but in all of minor league baseball.
Wow.
So I like bottom 5 winning. And the big root cause of that was poor pitching. Just they had ER. I mean, you just look at the team ERAs or whatever you want to look at there, or how many runs they gave up total. And it just was like astonishing. It was galactically problematic. And they had to kind of reposition after that. And, it wasn't that they didn't have talent in the system. It's just how it was then being used, what level it was at, and then the complete lack of a modern structure around it was catching up with them. Well, no, actually, let me rephrase that. The lack of a modern structure, the pushing them ahead, all of that did catch up with them. It wasn't catching up with them. And then we had the added point that they didn't have a first-round pick in 2017, this is about the time that they would really get some impact from 2017, and that didn't happen.
Looking forward, Derrick, like, what is your gut feel on kind of what the Bloom era may look like, how it may impact the Cubs-Cardinals rivalry? Because I feel like, when Theo and then Madden came to Chicago, that was certainly a shift. And Andrew Friedman went to the Dodgers. People are like, wow, this could be.
Oh, yeah.
Even David Stearns has made an impact in New York from afar. Like Sahadev said, I get what they're doing. I think it could work. I think Bloom still has a lot to show. I don't think he's quite at that level. What's been kind of the local reaction and your read on where this is heading?
It's tough in two senses. One, you don't want to say that social media is reflective of the whole fan base, right? Like, it's just not. It's
hope not.
Right?
Yeah, it's the loudest cul-de-sac, but maybe it's the loudest neighborhood now.
Yeah.
But I think there's fatigue. And Chaim is somebody new, so that's helpful. I mean, we spent some time here kind of cataloging the length of time that this front office group, particularly Mozeliak, has been here. That's a long time. I mean, it is, and he recognizes that. The Cardinals recognize that. They've put such an emphasis on continuity, and I remember back in like 2019, 2018. When we had one of these press conferences with ownership, and I asked them if they ever worry that continuity becomes a euphemism for accepting a team that's become stale. Like, are they stale or siloed off? And I got heavy pushback on that question. But a few years later, I'm like, well, I kind of maybe had a point, right? So Chaim is new and fresh, and so that's being well received. I don't think people buy tickets or don't buy tickets based on the front office.
Sure.
There are definitely some people in St. Louis who are out to prove me wrong on that, which is fine. But I don't know if they'll buy tickets to come see Chaim Bloom. But I think one thing that the Cardinals have in mind is, all right, what has Tampa Bay done really well? And what have the Dodgers benefited from because of what Tampa Bay does really well?
Mhm.
All right. What did Chaim learn from being with the Red Sox as far as baseball royalty, baseball legacy, baseball pressure, and
Yeah.
championship expectations? Now, if you give him a chance, which to Sahadev's point, maybe he didn't get in Boston.
Yeah.
If you give him a chance to do the Tampa Bay thing with a historic team and a bigger payroll, ultimately, he's got a 5-year deal, which means he'll be here 6 more years. His 5-year deal doesn't start until he takes over. So this is not a small commitment on either side.
Yeah.
And I know that contracts guarantee dollars, not years, but there is a definite implication here that he is going to get a long runway to lead them into what they want to be. Part of that is because of the TV situation, the ticket sales and everything like that. He's not going to have the full wallet from which to see if he can swing and do some damage in the division with bigger spending until later. They're going to trim costs. The way that Mozeliak put it, I thought was really interesting was like they're going to reduce cost. He said it. They're going to reduce payroll. And they want to get into a spot where all the things that they are going to try to accomplish this year, when that is ready to contend, they spend. And it sure seems like, okay, that model makes sense. That actually, if they do it that way, is kind of the argument that has been going on here for several years, is why stop just shy of spending so much? Like, we asked, like, okay, you traded for Paul Goldschmidt, makes a lot of sense. You're going to get a really good player at really good value. Why then stop? Why not then say, all right, well, Bryce Harper, you want to be a part of this?
Yeah.
Right? Because that was all at the same time. Or, why, like, you get, Gibson, Lynn, and Sonny Gray are different examples, but like the stopping short, like, of why not go after that top pitcher or even the third best pitcher in the market and instead say, well, we're going to throw 4 homegrown and 1-year veteran on a bounce back at that problem. So I'm eager to see if they are able to, air traffic control or triangulate or whatever verb you want to use, right? Or analogy you want to use, all these pieces to come together at a time. When Chaim then is in charge, he has the farm system that he modernized and built. And essentially, they are handing him a classic car and saying, we need you to make this energy efficient. And then we need you to drive it. And when you do that, then we will give you the custom paint job of your dreams.
Right.
Like, that's what they're doing. And I'm eager to see how that works.
Yeah, I am too. I think this question, I think, is very relevant to the Cubs, because in my opinion, if what you're saying works and works well, the Cardinals once again become that team that the Cubs were talking about, a decade plus ago, of like, this is who we're chasing, right?
Yeah.
This is who we want to be. And right now that's the Brewers. I think it's very interesting how that narrative has shifted, and the Brewers.
Is it because you know what, we're talking here October 9th, and the Brewers
and
are
they're not
the Cubs and Cardinals are.
They're not
really impressive. I give them a lot of credit. That was a really impressive year. But I don't know. Go ahead with your question, but
no, I
reserve the right to ask a question of you guys that I would really like to ask. Okay.
I don't disagree with where I think you're headed. I think my point is, as far as the division goes, that's who these teams are chasing, right? And what the Brewers have done is impressive in that sense, but postseason seems to be a different beast. But what I'm curious about is how how far down are we looking for the Cardinals as far as is this a rebuild? Like how bad could this get for them as far as major league product 2025, 2026? Is this a point where the Cubs don't have to worry about the Cardinals for the next few years, which if it's true in my opinion, all the more reason why the Cubs need to be aggressive right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I still reserve the right to ask my question, but I don't. I want to see how they get through this winter, because like they're going to go young, right? Well, does that mean they're going to trade Ryan Helsley? If they trade Ryan Helsley, that's a huge signal, right?
Yeah.
I think they have these signals along the way, right? Maybe first and foremost would be what they do with the option of Kyle Gibson. If they're out to just cut costs, which they are, then that's an easy 12 to drop, right? Even for a guy that you could really use,
Right.
especially if you want to bend Young elsewhere in the rotation. It'd be pretty good to have a veteran like that who pitched like he did, who, I'll add this, who meant a lot to that clubhouse. He meant a lot to that club. He brought a lot. There were times where it was like, like the Cardinals clubhouse, right? The guys who've been Cardinals forever, Adam Wainwright, Chris Carpenter will come back around and everything like that. And it was like Kyle Gibson's been here for 5 minutes and it feels like he was here for 50 years. I mean, he just was that guy. And it was very clear. So if they make that call, then it's money. I mean, unless they like come out with like a real explanation baseball wise, it's money. So I think that's another one that signals how competitive they're going to be this year. The big ones are conversations yet to be had, ongoing with Arenado and Sonny Gray. Sonny Gray specifically signed here to contend every year and also be close to home. If the Cardinals are not going to do that, will he waive his no trade clause to go to a team that he thinks has a better chance to win? Arenado orchestrated and was receptive to that trade and made it possible by deferring a lot of money to win. And if the Cardinals are going to, go, well, we're going to bend more towards the Rockies than we are the Dodgers, that's really not why he's here. And so I think those things along those lines. I will add this part, though. Like, they say they're going young, but let's qualify that because, like, Lars Nootbaar is entering the middle part of his late 20s. Brendan Donovan is entering the later part of his late 20s. These are two guys who they want big things from, and while they're youth, they still have youth, right? They still have pitchers and players 25 and under: Mason Wynn, Jordan Walker, Nolan Gorman. Ivan Herrera. These guys are still talents that are younger than 25. There are parts of this team that if you say go young are still supposed to be in their peaks. And if you're not getting peak production from them, they're not going to be a part of the future. So I think that's a real interesting part of this. Like, are they going to try to walk the line again? They're not calling it a rebuild. They're calling it a reset. And for a lot of this time, they've kind of balanced on this fence of not going all in and not going all out. And are there elements where they're still going to do that same thing here? And I wonder if that means that they're going to kind of probably muddle around that 500 again, but will they show signs that they're going to zoom 10 wins higher, 11 wins higher? So I'm really eager to see just how far they go. And that's brings us back to the Helsley thing, where if they trade him and try to just get the haul of prospects that he would bring in, then that's a sign that, okay, no, we're really looking at this as like playing in 2025, who's going to help in 2027. I then will watch for what does that mean for Lars Nootbaar? Where does that put Brendan Donovan? Brendan Donovan, who could be the leader of this team in a lot of ways, a real classic kind of Cardinal player. Where does he fit into that world as he nears and reaches arbitration and control for 3 more years? While are they going to contend in those 3 years? So I don't really have an answer for you because it's October. Right. But I think that by Christmas is going to be a really fascinating question. All right, so now can I ask my question of you guys?
Yeah.
We'll call it a reset. We'll call it a reset.
Yeah, they call it a reset. I was struck by the fact that they just went so far out of the way not to call it a rebuild. I asked Bill DeWitt Jr. I said, is this a rebuild? And I said, and he's like, no, we were using the word reset. And I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? What's the message to the fans? Put it in their terms, not business terms. Put it in terms that the fans connect with, not the terms that the 12 priorities of business understand, like the boardroom understands.
Right.
And he said, we're going young. He said, we are going young. That's the message to fans. We are going young. But that they never once said that meant uncompetitive. It could mean that we're going young, quote unquote. And if those young players perform, then they'll compete. So my question to you guys is, what the heck is the deal with the National League Central saying we're gonna, the Cubs, you just mentioned it, the Brewers certainly are built this way. Win the division. Hey, does anybody want to step out of line of the National League Central and say we're gonna win the National League? Is it just so coastal now that they're like, well, we got our little acreage of the continent. We're going to try to win here, guys, and then see what it takes in October, because it ain't working in October, not like it used to. So who's going to step out and say, hey, Midwest pride, the American League Central is doing all the heavy lifting. What's up with that?
I don't disagree with you, Derrick, and it's something Patrick brings up a lot, and I think Patrick's right. What is the message here? Is it, why are we talking about the division like this? There was a different message when Theo arrived and when Theo was in charge in 15 and 16 and those years. The message wasn't try to, yes, sure, get in the playoffs year after year after year. That should be the goal. Absolutely. But where's the World Series talk? I feel like Council kind of went there when he said, we have to have higher aspirations and talked about, building a 90-win team. I think that's a little bit more aggressive than what we've been hearing of late, but I think you're right. I think you make a good point. Why is this talk about the division? What is that? That's that's football talk. That's the Bears saying we're gonna win the North and never, or take the North and never give it back. I appreciate that when you're facing the Green Bay Packers and all that, but still, World Series should be the goal. Winning, taking out the Dodgers and Atlanta and those types of teams, the Phillies. That I agree with you 100%. I don't know why they're it's verboten to talk about those teams.
I don't get it either. It just seems like the Dodgers are such a financial and player development beast that no team wants to be like, well, we're going to take that on, except for the Padres, but they kind of have to. I find that fascinating, and it's something that I've asked the Cardinals about. And they can push back because that those top seeds really haven't worked out, but we'll see. But the bye week hasn't exactly been the buffer that you want to earn necessarily. But the notion that you go win the division and try to get in, totally understand that. In fact, Theo was one of the first guys to ever bring that up to me back in 2004 in the World Series. I find it very fascinating that he was the guy who first kind of talked about just the randomness of the postseason. Build a team to get there and then see how hot you can get while you're there. The 04 Boston team being a great example, as they took down one of the best Cardinal teams this city's ever seen in 4 games. And, he brought that up, and Cardinal fans get frustrated. They're just building a team to eke into the playoffs and then get lucky. It's well, that's every team. Every team is doing that. Jerry DiPoto said it out loud, and everybody everybody had a spit take. I was like, we've been hearing this for years. Theo brought it up in 04, but the notion that the National League Central is sequestering itself into this little tournament to decide who loses in the first round is just a joke.
I agree.
That's the perfect clip right there. You got the soundbite right there. I think
it's like they're the mid-major. Go be the Big Ten.
I do think it feels like you've been reading some of our Slack messages and brainstorming sessions that Sahadev and I had of kind of off-season stories that we're working on, because I do think teams kind of take on certain elements of their leadership. And when you're talking about projections instead of parades, and when you point to the Diamondbacks getting in last year as this like shining example of randomness, as opposed to what the Cubs, when they were puffing their chests out not that long ago, was wanting to be like the New England Patriots, the Golden State Warriors. Obviously, we're talking about, the Belichick Brady Patriots, not what's going on now, but like they want to be like Manchester United, like like global thing. And now it's like, there's a daunting gap between them and the Brewers. Like, are you kidding me? Like, that's like, I get the whole point of you have to get into the playoffs over and over and over again. That's something, that is kind of, I think everyone agrees upon now, but just this lowering of sights and kind of softening of expectations is definitely, I'm sure Scott Boras has some sort of Midwest analogy that he'll be trotting out this off season, but you're right. It is.
Yeah, he'll come up with some. He'll call it the flyover country, as in like the trophy only flies over it.
Yes. I mean, you look at the Yankees, both New York teams. You look at the Padres are a direct reflection of their late owner and their maverick GM. Like,
yes,
and that's what I wonder.
And they did run a debt. Like, should call it. Yeah. They did run a debt and need help. So there is something there.
But I think you're absolutely right. Of just teams, the mid-major division is sadly accurate.
Yeah, that's where we're at. Oh well. I mean, I find it fascinating because like Houston can do what Houston did, right? And however many ALCSs, there's 7, I think, right? 7 in a row, and constantly in the playoffs. And they can play to the randomness of the postseason and yet get there and turn it on its ear, and not just do it with the same manager. Though it should be noted that manager is back in the postseason and sure seems to have an approach with a new team that is, I don't know if it'll get to the ALCS, but it's working with a team that a lot of people did not think would emerge from 500, let alone play past the NL Central, the entire NL Central in the postseason. So there's definitely something to the randomness of the postseason. Get in, get hot, get going. The Dodgers are on the brink. Part of why they're on the brink is because they don't have the pitching. Part of it is they're also facing a blowtorch designed to beat them.
Right.
Like, we'll see if that happens, but that team is out. The Padres are out to beat them, and they have a manager who is eager to do that. I speak from knowledge of this. The Yankees, we'll see where the Yankees go. They seem to be better positioned. And I find it fascinating, the argument out in New York that the Yankees have to beat the American League Central. I think that's a really interesting positioning to the postseason because, I mean, it's true. But they spend all year going up against one of the toughest divisions in baseball, that American League East. And now to get to the promised land of a pennant in the World Series, they got to beat the American League Central. If they falter, like, what are the ingredients that Houston has had, and what are the ingredients that we see AJ Hinch rely on in Detroit that tell us what October, how you reduce the randomness? Well, baseball's all probability, right?
Yeah.
So
but how do you randomness?
Yeah. How do you shrink the randomness? Because you're never going to get away from it, because you're going to run into a Jeff Weaver who is pitching great, or a Madison Bumgarner who's pitching great, or a Nathan Eovaldi who's pitching great, or a Arizona team that just plays a style that causes havoc, right? And has hot hitters at the right time, and also good pitching, and a bullpen that throws a lot of. But so how do you reduce the randomness? And that seems to be a key point for the NL Central to get to which of these teams is going to be Houston? Which of these teams is going to be Houston, and not say we're out to win the division? because the American League West is pretty vulnerable to a long-term, division leader, or has been. It's hard to say the NL Central isn't the same.
All right. Yeah, and I mean the Cubs should be. There's no reason why the Cubs shouldn't be that team, right? Taking over this division. There's no other financial comparison in the division, and they should. I'm sure they think it's true, but they should have the power in the front office to be able to do this, right? It's the decision making and the people. They certainly have. Jed Hoyer has the background. We just haven't seen the results yet with this team. I think it's a fascinating discussion, Derrick, and I think we could probably talk to you for another hour here. We'll
save it for the GM meetings.
Yeah.
We'll have
right.
together then.
Or winter meetings over the Yukon Jack.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess the Brewers. Yeah. The Brewers get that.
Oh yeah.
Barely.
Thanks so much for joining us, Derrick. We appreciate it. I really appreciate your knowledge of this organization. Clearly a fascinating time right now with them, and I'm fascinated to see where it goes. I'm curious to see what direction it goes, and how much of an impact Bloom has over the however long it'll be. Because I think it's going to be good. I just don't know when. And I think that's fascinating to follow, because with St. Louis, it was always like, when? Now. That's the answer, when it'll be good.
Right,
and
great
yeah. So it's a little different, but it also doesn't mean it's bad. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you soon. We'll hit you up, I guess, a month from now in San Antonio.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Derrick.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a great day. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks so much to Derrick Goold for joining us. Like I said, he has a ton of info on the Cardinals. It's like reading a book on the Cardinals when listening to Derrick talk. Just fascinating stuff. Really interesting point where the Cardinals are at. Thank you so much for listening to us. This is Northside Territory. Make sure to rate, review, subscribe on all your different platforms. Subscribe on YouTube. That helps us a ton. And of course, subscribe to Patrick and my work at The Athletic. We will be on top of the Cubs all winter long. Obviously a big point for the Cubs as well, not just the Cardinals. The Cubs have a lot of work to do. We have a month of playoffs, and then the offseason begins in earnest. We will see what direction the Cubs go, what they can do. We know what direction they're headed as far as what they need to do as far as winning and losing. But where do they go to get those wins is the question, and we'll be looking to answer those for you in the coming weeks. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Take care.